The snow came down so thick that February morning in 1883 that Felicity Wagner couldn't see her own hand stretched out before her face, and by the time she realized her wagon had drifted off the mountain pass, the wheels were already sinking into drifts deeper than her waist. She'd been traveling from Denver to the mining town of Fairplay, Colorado, carrying medical supplies for the doctor who'd hired her as his assistant, a respectable position for a 22-year-old woman who'd spent the last 3 years nursing her ailing mother through consumption. The elderly driver who'd agreed to take her up the mountain pass had fallen ill the night before at their last stop, leaving Felicity with no choice but to drive the wagon herself or wait another week for the next supply run. She'd thought herself capable, thought her determination would be enough to see her through the treacherous journey, but the blizzard had other plans. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at her coat and freezing the tears that sprang to her eyes. The horses whinnied in distress, their breath coming out in great white plumes as they struggled against the harness. Felicity tried to calm them, but her voice was lost in the roar of the storm. She could feel the wagon tilting dangerously to one side as it settled deeper into the snowdrift, and panic clawed at her chest. The supplies, she thought desperately, all those medicines that people in Fairplay needed. And beyond that, the more primal fear. She was going to die out here, alone, frozen in a white tomb with no one to know or care what had become of her. She'd barely had time to process that thought when she heard something over the wind, a sound that might have been a shout. Felicity strained to listen, her heart hammering against her ribs. There it was again, definitely a human voice, though she couldn't make out the words. She tried to call back, but her throat was raw from the cold and barely any sound came out. The wagon lurched again, settling even deeper, and the horses screamed their fear. Then through the white curtain of snow, a figure appeared, tall and broad-shouldered, leading a sturdy bay horse. The man moved with purpose despite the storm, as if he knew these mountains in his bones and wouldn't let a little weather stop him. He reached the wagon in moments, his face mostly hidden by a heavy scarf and wide-brimmed hat, but she could see his eyes, a striking gray-green like storm clouds over summer grass, focused intently on her situation. "Are you hurt?" He shouted over the wind, and his voice was deep and steady, the kind of voice that made you believe everything might actually be all right. "No," Felicity managed, though her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely form the word. "But the wagon, it's stuck, and I have medical supplies that need to get to Fairplay." The man didn't waste time with more questions. He moved around the wagon, assessing the situation, and even through the blinding snow, Felicity could see the grim set of his jaw. The wagon had slid into a drift that must have been 6 feet deep, with more snow piling on by the minute. The horses were exhausted from their struggle, foam flecking their mouths despite the bitter cold. "I'm going to get you out," he said, moving closer so she could hear him better. "But first we need to unhitch these horses before they hurt themselves. Can you climb down?" Felicity nodded and tried to move, but her legs were so numb from the cold that they barely responded. The man saw her struggle and didn't hesitate. He reached up and lifted her bodily from the wagon seat, setting her on more solid ground, though even that was buried in snow up to her knees. His hands were strong and sure, and for just a moment, pressed against his solid chest, Felicity felt warm for the first time in hours. "Stay close to me," he instructed, then turned his attention to the horses. He worked with efficient grace, unhitching them from the wagon even as the storm raged around them. Felicity tried to help, but her frozen fingers fumbled uselessly at the leather straps. The man never showed impatience, just gently moved her hands aside and finished the job himself. Once the horses were free, he tied them to his own mount, all three animals huddling together against the wind. Then he turned back to the wagon, which was now almost completely buried, and Felicity's heart sank. There had to be $300 worth of medicine in there, maybe more, everything from laudanum to quinine to surgical instruments. Dr. Harrison had advanced her the money for the journey on the promise that she'd see the supplies through safely, and now she was going to lose everything, including her new position before she'd even started. "The supplies," she said, and even to her own ears, her voice sounded desperate. "I have to get them out." The man looked at the buried wagon, then at her, and something in his expression softened. "Then we'll dig," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to stand in a blizzard digging out a stranger's wagon. He had a shovel strapped to his saddle, which he retrieved, and then he started digging. The snow was heavy and wet, each shovelful probably weighing 20 pounds or more, and it just kept coming down, filling in the holes almost as fast as he could make them. Felicity tried to help with her bare hands, scooping snow away from the wagon bed, but it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a teacup. "Get back," the man said, not unkindly. "Your hands will freeze." "I can't just stand here and watch you work," Felicity protested, though she was shaking so hard now that she could barely stand. The man paused in his digging and looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment, some recognition that felt deeper than the circumstances warranted. "What's your name?" he asked, his breath frosting in the air between them. "Felicity Wagner," she said. "Garrett Zimmerman," he replied, then added, "And I'm going to get your supplies out, Miss Wagner, even if I have to dig until spring. But first, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Don't die of cold while I'm working." There was a hint of dry humor in his voice that made Felicity want to laugh despite everything. "There's a blanket in my saddlebag and some jerky. Get them both and wrap up." Felicity wanted to argue, but she was cold enough that even her pride couldn't stand up to common sense. She retrieved the blanket, which smelled like horses and leather and something else. Something warm and masculine that was probably just Garrett Zimmerman himself, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The jerky was tough and salty, and the best thing she'd ever tasted. And then she watched Garrett dig. He worked with a steady rhythm, driving the shovel into the snow, lifting, throwing over and over again. His coat was quickly covered in white, his hat brim heavy with accumulation, but he never slowed. An hour passed, maybe more. Time became strange in the white void of the storm. Felicity's feet went completely numb despite her boots, and she knew she should probably be more worried about that. But she was mesmerized by the sight of this stranger working to save her livelihood, asking nothing in return. "Why are you doing this?" she called out at one point when he paused to catch his breath. Garrett looked up at her, snow clinging to his dark beard, and said, "Because you need help. You don't even know me. Doesn't matter." He went back to digging, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that said the conversation was over, that this was just what a person did when another person needed help. End of discussion. Another hour passed. Garrett's movements were getting slower now, the fatigue showing despite his strength. He'd managed to dig down to the wagon bed, and Felicity could see the corner of one of the supply crates, but there was still so much snow, and it just kept falling. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the daylight, what little there was starting to fade. "Garrett," Felicity said, and his name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar for a man she'd known for less than 3 hours, but also perfectly right. "Maybe we should leave it. You're going to hurt yourself." He straightened up, leaning on the shovel, and looked at her with those storm cloud eyes. "Do people in Fairplay need these medicines?" "Yes, but then we don't leave them." He thrust the shovel back into the snow with renewed vigor, and Felicity felt something catch in her chest, some emotion too big and complicated to name. She moved closer, ignoring the cold that had worked its way into her bones, and started helping again with her hands. Garrett opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. They worked together in silence, the only sounds the howl of wind and the rasp of their breathing. Felicity's hands were so numb they didn't even hurt anymore, which she suspected was probably bad, but she couldn't stop. If Garrett Zimmerman was willing to dig until spring for her, then she could at least help him do it. As the gray afternoon light faded toward evening, they finally cleared enough snow to reach the supply crates. There were 4 of them, each one heavy and awkward, packed with bottles that clinked ominously with every movement. Garrett hauled them out one by one, muscles straining under his coat, and stacked them on the ground away from the drift. The last one caught on something, and he had to crawl half into the buried wagon to work it free, snow cascading down on him as he moved. When all 4 crates were out, he stood there breathing hard, his face red with exertion despite the cold, and looked at Felicity with something like triumph in his eyes. "Got them," he said, and grinned, and Felicity found herself grinning back like a fool, giddy with relief and cold and something else entirely. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt desperately inadequate. "Thank you so much. I don't know how I can ever—" "We're not done yet," Garrett interrupted, his expression turning serious again. "We can't stay here, and those crates are too heavy to carry in this storm. We need to get to shelter before dark, and we need to move now." He was right, of course. The temperature was dropping fast, and Felicity was already colder than she'd ever been in her life. But the crates, they couldn't just leave them here after all that work. Garrett seemed to read her mind. "We'll come back for them tomorrow once the storm passes. I'll mark the spot and we can load them onto a fresh wagon. But right now, your life is worth more than medicine." Felicity wanted to argue, but her body was starting to shut down, the cold working its way past skin and muscle to somewhere deep inside. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and let Garrett help her onto his horse. He covered the supply crates as best he could with canvas from the wagon, weighted it down with snow, and then mounted behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. The 3 wagon horses were tied in a line behind them, and Garrett urged his bay forward into the storm. Felicity had no idea where they were going or how he could possibly know the way when she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. But Garrett moved with certainty, guiding the horse with subtle shifts of weight and pressure. The animal trusted him, that much was clear, and Felicity found herself trusting him too, this stranger who'd appeared out of the blizzard like something from a storybook. She must have dozed off, or maybe passed out from the cold, because the next thing she knew they were stopped in front of a cabin, small and sturdy, built right into the side of the mountain. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and light glowed in the single window, and Felicity had never seen anything so beautiful in her entire life. Garrett dismounted and lifted her down, and she realized with distant alarm that she couldn't feel her feet at all. He seemed to notice too, because he picked her up without ceremony and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them against the storm. The cabin was small, just one room with a stove in the corner, a bed against one wall, a rough wooden table and 2 chairs, and not much else. But it was warm and dry and safe. Garrett set her down in one of the chairs close to the stove and immediately set to work on her boots. Felicity tried to protest, embarrassed at the intimacy of a strange man touching her feet, but he ignored her completely, unlacing the frozen leather with practiced efficiency. When he pulled off her stockings, she gasped at the sight of her feet, white and waxy looking, and fear spiked through her exhaustion. "Frostbite," she whispered. "Maybe," Garrett said grimly. "We need to warm them slowly, not too fast, or it'll hurt worse. Can you feel anything?" Felicity concentrated, and after a moment she thought she could feel a distant tingling, like pins and needles magnified 1,000 times. She nodded, and Garrett looked relieved. "That's good. Means the damage isn't too bad." He filled a basin with lukewarm water from a pitcher by the stove and gently lowered her feet into it. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, pain flooding through her like fire, and Felicity bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. "I know it hurts," Garrett said quietly, his hands steady on her ankles. "But it means you're warming up. That's good, even though it doesn't feel like it." Felicity nodded, gripping the edge of the chair so hard her knuckles went white. Garrett stayed right there, kneeling on the floor in front of her, monitoring the water temperature and gradually adding warmer water as her feet adjusted. He'd taken off his coat and hat, and Felicity got her first real look at him in the lamplight. He was probably 26 or 27, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and a beard that was neatly trimmed despite the rough mountain living. His features were strong and even, the kind of face that would be called handsome in any era, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, those unusual gray-green eyes that seemed to see right through her. "You live here alone?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the pain and partly because she was curious. "Most of the time," Garrett replied. "I have a ranch about 5 miles from here, closer to Fairplay proper, but I keep this cabin for when I'm working the higher grazing lands. Was up checking on some cattle when I saw the storm coming in and knew I should take shelter. Saw your wagon a couple hours later, recognized it was in trouble. Lucky for me," Felicity said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Lucky for both of us that I was in the right place." He looked up at her and smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer, and Felicity felt her heart do a strange little skip in her chest. She told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural response to someone who'd saved her life, but she wasn't entirely convinced. As feeling returned to her feet and the pain gradually subsided to a more manageable ache, Garrett went back outside to tend to the horses. He was gone for 20 minutes, and Felicity spent that time looking around the cabin, taking in the details of how this man lived. It was neat, everything in its place but not sterile. There were books on a small shelf, their spines worn from reading. A guitar leaned in one corner. A photograph on the mantel showed a younger Garrett with an older couple, probably his parents, all three of them unsmiling in the formal way of photographs, but with a warmth in their eyes that the camera had somehow captured. When Garrett came back in, his coat was white with fresh snow and his cheeks were red from the cold. "Storm's getting worse," he reported, shaking snow off his hat. "We're not going anywhere tonight, maybe not tomorrow either." Felicity felt a flutter of nerves at the thought of spending the night alone with a man she'd just met, propriety and reputation warring with practicality, and the simple fact that she had no other choice. Garrett must have seen something in her face because he said, "You can have the bed. I'll sleep by the stove, and I promise on my mother's grave that I'll be a perfect gentleman." "Your mother's grave?" Felicity echoed, glancing at the photograph. Garrett's expression softened with old grief. "She died 2 years ago. Influenza. My father went 6 months later, couldn't live without her. They'd been married 35 years. He said it matter-of-factly, but Felicity could hear the pain underneath, the kind of pain that came from loving people deeply and losing them too soon. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I lost my mother 4 months ago. Consumption. I nursed her for 3 years, watched her get weaker and weaker until there was nothing left. That's why I took the position in Fairplay. I needed to get away from Denver, away from all the memories. They looked at each other across the small cabin. Two people who understood loss in a way that changed you, marked you, made you see the world differently. It created a kind of instant intimacy that might have taken weeks or months to develop under normal circumstances. "I'm going to make us something to eat," Garrett said finally, breaking the moment. "Nothing fancy, but it'll be hot." He cooked beans and salt pork on the stove, along with cornbread that he mixed up from supplies in a tin. It was simple food, the kind cowboys and ranchers lived on, but after the day they'd had, it tasted like a feast. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the storm howling outside but distant now, held at bay by sturdy log walls and the warmth of the stove. "So you're going to be Dr. Harrison's assistant," Garrett said eventually, mopping up bean juice with a piece of cornbread. "He's a good man. Delivered half the babies in Fairplay, including me. You were born in Fairplay, not quite in town, but close enough. My parents had a ranch here before Colorado was even a state, back when it was still territory. They were some of the first settlers after the gold rush died down, and people started realizing cattle was a better bet than mining for most folks." He leaned back in his chair, his expression distant with memory. "It was a good childhood, hard but good. They taught me to love this land, the mountains, and the high country. Can't imagine living anywhere else." Felicity found herself leaning forward, interested despite her exhaustion. "What's it like ranching up here? It must be difficult with the winters." "It is," Garrett admitted. "But there's good grazing in the summer, and the cattle that survive the winter are tough, worth good money. I run about 200 head, which isn't huge, but it's enough for one man. I hire help for the spring roundup and fall branding, but otherwise I work it myself." "Don't you get lonely?" The question slipped out before Felicity could stop it, too personal for someone she'd just met, but Garrett didn't seem offended. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "But I have neighbors and I go into town often enough. There's a dance every month at the community hall and church on Sundays for those who are inclined. It's not like I'm a hermit." "But no wife?" Felicity asked, then immediately felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." Garrett's smile was a little sad. "No wife. Came close once about 3 years ago. Girl from Denver visiting her aunt in Fairplay. We courted for 6 months and I thought she was the one. But when it came down to it, she couldn't handle the isolation, the hard winters, the sheer amount of work it takes to keep a ranch running. She went back to Denver and married a banker." "I'm sorry," Felicity said, and meant it. "It's all right. Better to find out before the wedding than after." He looked at her appraisingly, not in a rude way but with genuine curiosity. "What about you? Leaving anyone special behind in Denver?" Felicity shook her head. "The last 3 years of my life were all about taking care of my mother. There wasn't time for courting or romance, not that anyone was particularly interested. By the time a woman reaches 22 without a husband, people start assuming something's wrong with her." "That's nonsense," Garrett said firmly. 22 is young, and from what I've seen today, there's not a thing wrong with you except maybe a tendency to drive wagons alone in blizzards." Felicity laughed despite herself, surprised at how good it felt. "Yes, well, I'm learning that was perhaps not my wisest decision." "It was brave," Garrett corrected. "Foolish, maybe, but brave. Not many women would have even tried, and you kept your head when things went wrong. That counts for something." The warmth in his voice made Felicity's chest feel tight, and she looked down at her plate to hide whatever expression was probably showing on her face. She'd spent so long being the capable one, the responsible one, the daughter who gave up her own life to care for her dying mother, that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than dutiful. Garrett's praise, simple as it was, meant more than he could possibly know. They finished their meal and cleaned up together, moving around the small cabin in an easy rhythm that belied how recently they'd met. Garrett insisted that Felicity take the bed, and when she tried to argue, he just gave her a look that said the discussion was over and started laying out blankets by the stove. Felicity lay in Garrett's bed, which smelled like him, that same warm masculine scent from the blanket on the trail, and listened to the storm rage outside. She should have been thinking about the supplies, about whether they'd still be there in the morning, about how she was going to explain all this to Dr. Harrison. Instead, she found herself thinking about the man lying on the floor across the room, about the way he'd dug for hours without complaint, the way he'd said he'd dig until spring if he had to, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She was being ridiculous, she told herself. It was just gratitude, just the natural tendency to feel attached to someone who'd saved your life. It wasn't attraction, wasn't interest, wasn't the beginning of something that could be real and lasting. She barely knew him. They'd spent one difficult day together, that was all. But as she drifted off to sleep, warm and safe and dry, she couldn't quite make herself believe it. The storm blew itself out sometime in the night, and Felicity woke to bright sunshine streaming through the cabin window and the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was and why. Her feet ached, but the pain was the normal kind, not the frightening numbness of frostbite, and when she carefully wiggled her toes, everything seemed to work properly. Garrett was already up and dressed, standing at the stove stirring something in a pan. He looked over when he heard her moving and smiled. "Morning. How do you feel?" "Surprisingly good, considering," Felicity said. She was still fully dressed except for her boots, and she felt rumpled and self-conscious in the morning light. "How long have you been awake?" "Couple of hours. Been out to check the horses and dig us a path to the door. Snow's about 4 feet deep in places, but at least it's stopped coming down." He ladled whatever he'd been cooking into 2 bowls and brought them over. "Oatmeal. Not exciting, but it'll stick to your ribs." They ate breakfast in the sunshine-filled cabin, and Felicity marveled at how different everything looked in daylight. The storm had transformed the landscape outside into a pristine white wilderness, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. If Garrett hadn't found her yesterday, she would be buried under all that snow right now, frozen and dead, and the thought made her shiver despite the warmth of the cabin. "We should head out in about an hour," Garrett said, reading her thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "Need to retrieve your supply crates before someone else stumbles across them, and I want to get you to Fairplay before another storm moves in. Weather's unpredictable this time of year." "Will we be able to find them? Everything looks so different covered in snow." "I marked the spot with a cairn before we left. We'll find them." He said it with such confidence that Felicity didn't doubt him for a second. They packed up the cabin and headed out, Felicity riding behind Garrett again, with the 3 wagon horses trailing behind. The journey that had been a terrifying white void yesterday was revealed in daylight as a narrow mountain pass with steep drops on one side and towering rock faces on the other. Felicity's stomach lurched when she realized how close she'd come to driving right off the edge, how easily her wagon could have tumbled down the mountainside instead of sliding into a drift. Garrett felt her tense and said over his shoulder, "Try not to think about it. You're safe now." But that was the problem, Felicity realized. She did feel safe, safer than she had in years, and it had everything to do with the solid warmth of the man in front of her and the steady strength of his arms on either side of her. She was starting to depend on Garrett Zimmerman, starting to trust him in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. And that was dangerous because in a few hours, she'd be in Fairplay starting her new life, and he'd go back to his ranch and his cattle, and they'd probably never see each other again. The thought made her absurdly sad, which was ridiculous. She barely knew him. One day, one night, that was all they'd had together. It wasn't enough to build anything real on, wasn't enough to justify the ache in her chest at the thought of saying goodbye. They reached the spot where the wagon had been buried, and true to his word, Garrett's cairn was still standing, a pile of rocks rising above the snow. He dismounted and started digging, and this time Felicity helped, her hands protected by a pair of his gloves that were too big but better than nothing. The supply crates were exactly where they'd left them, the canvas covering crusted with ice but intact. They loaded the crates onto the wagon horses, 2 per animal, securing them as best they could with rope. "Your wagon's a loss," Garrett said, looking at the buried hulk. "Even when the snow melts, it'll probably be too damaged to repair. But Dr. Harrison will understand once you explain what happened." Felicity nodded, trying not to think about the cost of replacing the wagon on top of everything else. She'd have to work for months just to pay back the expense of this trip, and she hadn't even started her job yet. But at least the supplies were safe, and she was alive, and that had to count for something. They made slow progress down the mountain with the heavily loaded horses, but the weather held, and by early afternoon, Fairplay came into view. It was a proper town, bigger than Felicity had expected, with a main street lined with businesses and houses spreading out in neat rows beyond. There was even a church with a white steeple that gleamed in the sun, and a 2-story building that looked like it might be a hotel. Garrett led them straight to a neat house on the edge of town with a sign out front that read, "Harrison Medical Practice." He dismounted and helped Felicity down, then knocked firmly on the door. It was opened almost immediately by a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Garrett," the doctor said, surprised. "What brings you to town?" Then he saw Felicity and the loaded horses, and his expression changed to one of concern. "Miss Wagner, I expected you yesterday. What happened?" The story came out in fits and starts, with Garrett filling in the parts that Felicity couldn't have known, about how bad the storm had been in the high country, about the sheer amount of snow that had fallen in just a few hours. Dr. Harrison listened with increasing alarm, and when they finished, he looked at Felicity with something like awe. "My dear young lady, you're incredibly fortunate to be alive. These winter storms kill people every year, experienced mountain men who know better than to be caught out in them." He glanced at Garrett. "I owe you a debt of gratitude for bringing her through safely." "She brought herself through," Garrett said quietly. "I just helped dig her out." Dr. Harrison supervised the unloading of the supply crates, checking each one carefully to make sure nothing had been damaged by the cold or rough handling. Everything was intact, and he looked genuinely relieved. "These medicines will save lives," he said to Felicity. "You've done well, despite the circumstances. Now, let's get you settled in your room and make sure you haven't suffered any lasting damage from your ordeal." He ushered Felicity inside, talking about examination and rest and hot meals, and she followed obediently, but at the door, she looked back at Garrett. He was standing by his horse, holding the reins, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Their eyes met across the snowy yard, and something passed between them. Some unspoken acknowledgement that what had happened on the mountain had meant something, even if neither of them could say exactly what. "Thank you," Felicity called out, knowing the words were inadequate but not knowing what else to say. "For everything." Garrett touched the brim of his hat in a small salute. "Welcome to Fairplay, Miss Wagner. I'm sure I'll see you around." Then he mounted his horse and rode away, and Felicity felt something tear inside her chest as she watched him go. Dr. Harrison was still talking, explaining about her duties and schedule and living arrangements, but she barely heard him. All she could think about was Garrett disappearing down the snowy street, taking with him the strange sense of safety and rightness she'd felt in his presence. The next week passed in a blur of activity as Felicity settled into her new position. Dr. Harrison's practice was busy, serving not just Fairplay but several smaller mining camps and ranches in the surrounding area. Felicity learned to assist with everything from setting broken bones to delivering babies, mixing medications to sterilizing surgical instruments. The work was demanding but satisfying, exactly the kind of fresh start she'd been hoping for. She lived in a small but comfortable room above the doctor's office, taking her meals with the Harrison family, which included the doctor's wife Martha, a cheerful woman who seemed determined to adopt Felicity as a surrogate daughter, and their two teenage children. It was pleasant and respectable, and exactly what she'd needed after the long, difficult years of nursing her mother. So why did she feel so restless? Why did she find herself looking out the window whenever she heard hoofbeats on the street, hoping to see a tall figure on a bay horse? Why did her heart sink a little every time it was someone else? She told herself she was being foolish. Garrett Zimmerman had a ranch to run, 5 miles outside of town. He probably came to Fairplay once a week at most, for supplies or business. There was no reason to expect to see him, no reason to think he was spending any time thinking about her. They'd shared one day together under extreme circumstances. That was all. It didn't mean anything. On her 10th day in Fairplay, Dr. Harrison asked her to accompany him on a house call to a ranch family whose youngest child had a persistent cough. They took the doctor's buggy, which was equipped with runners for the snow, and drove out into the countryside. The landscape was breathtaking, mountains rising on all sides, their peaks still heavy with snow while the lower elevations were starting to show hints of brown and green where the sun had melted the worst of it. Beautiful country, isn't it? Dr. Harrison said, guiding the horse along a well-traveled road. I came here 28 years ago, just after the gold rush, and I've never regretted it for a moment. There's something about these mountains that gets into your blood. Felicity nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She'd only been here a week, and already she felt the pull of the place, the vast sky and clean air and sense of possibility. They reached the ranch, a modest spread with a log house and several outbuildings, and spent an hour examining the child, a little girl of about 7 who did indeed have a worrying cough. Dr. Harrison prescribed a honey-based syrup and instructed the mother on how to keep the child's chest warm and clear. They were just preparing to leave when a rider approached, and Felicity's heart leapt into her throat before she could stop it. But it wasn't Garrett. It was a younger man, maybe 19 or 20, with similar features that marked him as probably a relative. He waved at them cheerfully and called out, "Doc Harrison, good to see you. Everything all right? Just a childhood cough, nothing serious. How's your brother doing, Tommy?" "Garrett's fine. Working himself to death as usual, but that's nothing new." The young man, Tommy, glanced at Felicity with open curiosity. "Is this your new assistant everyone's been talking about?" "This is Miss Felicity Wagner, yes. Felicity, this is Tommy Zimmerman. His family's ranch borders this property." "Zimmerman." Felicity felt her pulse quicken. "Are you related to Garrett Zimmerman?" Tommy grinned. "He's my older brother, best brother a man could ask for, even if he is a bit serious most of the time." His expression turned more thoughtful. "Say, aren't you the lady he rescued from the blizzard last week? He told me about that, said you were the bravest or most foolish woman he'd ever met. He couldn't decide which." Felicity didn't know whether to be flattered or insulted. "He said that." "He meant it as a compliment. Tommy assured her. Garrett doesn't give praise lightly. He was impressed with how you handled yourself up on that mountain. Talked about you quite a bit, actually, which is unusual for him. He's not much of a talker. Dr. Harrison was watching this exchange with interest, his eyebrows raised slightly. "Small world," he murmured. "Felicity, I didn't realize Garrett was the one who helped you. He didn't mention it when he brought you to my door." "He doesn't like to make a fuss," Tommy said. "But between you and me, Doc, I think that whole experience affected him more than he's letting on. He's been distracted all week, keeps staring off into space like he's thinking about something important." Felicity felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands, not trusting herself to speak. Could it be possible that Garrett was thinking about her the way she'd been thinking about him? Or was she reading too much into the words of a friendly younger brother? "Well, tell Garrett we said hello," Dr. Harrison said, gathering the reins. "And if he needs any medical attention, he knows where to find us." They drove back to Fairplay, and the doctor was mercifully silent for most of the journey, though Felicity could feel him glancing at her occasionally with a knowing expression. Finally, as they approached the edge of town, he said gently, "Garrett Zimmerman is one of the finest men I know. Honorable, hardworking, kind to his neighbors. If you were interested in him, you could do much worse." Felicity felt her blush deepen. "I'm not, I barely know him, You went through something intense together," Dr. Harrison interrupted. "That creates bonds faster than normal courtship ever could. I've seen it before, in situations of crisis or emergency. People who barely know each other can become deeply important to each other very quickly." He smiled at her kindly. "I'm just saying, if something were to develop, you'd have my blessing and my support. Martha's too, I'm sure." Felicity didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and looked out at the snowy landscape, her mind churning with confused emotions. She was attracted to Garrett, she could admit that much. More than attracted if she was being honest with herself. In one day, he'd become lodged in her heart in a way she didn't fully understand. But what could she do about it? She couldn't very well ride out to his ranch uninvited and declare her feelings, assuming she even knew what those feelings were. That would be forward and inappropriate and probably disastrous. So she threw herself into her work, helping Dr. Harrison with his patients, learning everything she could about medicine and treatment and the particular challenges of practicing in a mountain town. She attended church on Sunday, where she met more of the townspeople and began to feel like she might actually belong here. She helped Martha Harrison with the cooking and cleaning, earning her keep beyond just her medical work. And she tried not to think about Garrett Zimmerman more than a dozen times a day, which was a definite improvement over the 50 or 60 times she'd been thinking about him earlier. 2 weeks after the blizzard, on a clear, cold morning, Felicity was in the office cataloging supplies when the door opened and a familiar tall figure stepped inside. Her heart did that ridiculous leap again, and she had to take a breath to steady herself before she looked up. Garrett stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncertain in a way she hadn't seen before. His gray-green eyes found hers immediately, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Miss Wagner," he said finally, his deep voice sending a shiver down her spine. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Felicity managed, proud that her voice came out steady. "Dr. Harrison is out on a call, but he should be back within the hour if you need medical attention. I'm not here to see the doctor." Garrett took a step further into the office, turning his hat in his hands. "I came to see you, actually, to see how you're doing, if your feet healed up all right from the frostbite." "They're fine," Felicity said, holding up one foot as if to demonstrate, then feeling foolish. "No lasting damage thanks to your quick treatment." "Good, that's good." Garrett seemed to run out of words, and an awkward silence stretched between them. Then he said in a rush, "There's a dance tomorrow night at the community hall. Monthly social, everyone in town goes. I was wondering if you might like to attend. With me, if you're not busy." Felicity's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Are you asking me to accompany you to the dance, Mr. Zimmerman?" "Garrett," he corrected. "And yes, I am. I know we don't know each other well, but I'd like to remedy that if you're willing." He met her eyes steadily, and she could see vulnerability there, the risk of asking and potentially being rejected. "You've been on my mind quite a bit since the storm." "You've been on my mind too," Felicity admitted, then felt her cheeks heat at her own boldness. But it was too late to take it back, and truthfully, she didn't want to. "I'd very much like to go to the dance with you, Garrett." The smile that spread across his face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, transforming his serious features into something warm and open and impossibly attractive. "Tomorrow evening, then. I'll call for you at 7 if that suits." "That suits perfectly." Garrett stood there for another moment, as if he didn't quite want to leave, then seemed to remember himself. He put his hat back on and touched the brim in that gesture she was coming to recognize as characteristic. "Until tomorrow, Miss Wagner." "Felicity," she said, matching his earlier correction. "Please, Felicity." He said her name like he was tasting it, rolling it around in his mouth, and she felt warmth spread through her chest. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the office with a smile on her face that she couldn't have suppressed if she tried. Dr. Harrison returned an hour later to find Felicity practically floating through her tasks, humming under her breath. He took one look at her expression and grinned. "Let me guess. Garrett Zimmerman stopped by." Felicity couldn't help but laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes," the doctor said kindly. "And I'm pleased for you both. Garrett deserves someone special, and I think you might be just the person." The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Felicity found herself checking the clock every few minutes, willing the hours to pass faster. Martha Harrison, bless her, took pity and helped Felicity get ready, lending her a dress in a deep blue that brought out her eyes and styling her hair in a fashionable updo that was somehow both elegant and practical. "You look beautiful," Martha said, standing back to admire her work. "Garrett won't be able to take his eyes off you." Felicity studied her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the flushed, bright-eyed woman staring back at her. When had she started looking alive again, instead of just going through the motions? When had hope crept back into her heart? She knew the answer. It had been the moment a tall stranger appeared out of a blizzard and started digging. Garrett arrived exactly at 7, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed and his beard freshly trimmed. He looked nervous, which Felicity found endearing, and when he saw her coming down the stairs, his expression shifted to something that made her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said, echoing Martha's earlier words, and Felicity felt beautiful under the warmth of his gaze. They walked to the community hall together, Garrett offering his arm and Felicity taking it, very aware of the strength of his muscles under her hand. The hall was already full of people when they arrived, music spilling out into the cold night air, and Felicity felt a flutter of nervousness. She didn't know anyone here except the Harrisons and Garrett, and walking in on his arm was going to announce to the entire town that they were courting, or at least interested in each other. But Garrett seemed unbothered by the attention they drew. He kept her close to his side as they entered, nodding greetings to people they passed, and introduced her to so many neighbors and friends that her head spun trying to remember all the names. Everyone was friendly, curious about the new assistant to Dr. Harrison, interested in her story of the blizzard, though Garrett kept the details brief and downplayed his own role in her rescue. When the dancing started, Garrett led her onto the floor with a confidence that surprised her. She'd half expected him to be awkward or uncomfortable, but he moved with easy grace, guiding her through a waltz as naturally as he'd guided his horse through the storm. They didn't talk much, just moved together to the music, and Felicity felt something settle into place inside her, something that had been off-kilter for longer than she'd realized. Between dances, Garrett introduced her to his brother Tommy, who she recognized from their brief encounter on the road, and Tommy's girlfriend Sarah, a pretty brunette who immediately drew Felicity into conversation about the challenges of living in mountain country. Other young people joined them, and soon Felicity was laughing and chatting like she'd known these people for years instead of hours. Garrett watched her with satisfaction, pleased to see her fitting in so naturally. He'd been worried she might find Fairplay too isolated, too rough after city living, but she seemed genuinely happy. And when she looked at him, which was often, her eyes held a warmth that made his chest tight with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He was falling for her. He'd known it almost from the moment he'd lifted her down from that buried wagon, seen the determination in her face despite her fear. But he tried to tell himself it was just the drama of the situation, the natural protectiveness you felt towards someone in danger. That once he got her safely to town and went back to his normal life, the feeling would fade. It hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger until he'd found himself making excuses to ride into Fairplay more often than necessary, hoping for a glimpse of her. He'd pumped Tommy for information about what people were saying, whether she seemed happy, whether anyone else was showing interest in courting her. And finally, he'd worked up the courage to actually do something about his feelings instead of just mooning around like a lovesick boy. Now here she was in his arms again, smiling up at him like he'd hung the moon, and Garrett thought he might be the luckiest man in Colorado. "Are you having a good time?" he asked during a pause in the music, leading her off the floor to get some punch. "The best time," Felicity assured him. "Everyone's been so welcoming. I was nervous about being the outsider, but people seem genuinely glad I'm here." "They are. Good medical help is hard to come by in these mountains, and Dr. Harrison needed an assistant. But beyond that," Garrett handed her a cup of punch and lowered his voice, "they like you for yourself. You're easy to like, Felicity." She looked up at him, and the expression in her eyes made his breath catch. "So are you, Garrett, very easy." They stayed at the dance until late, neither of them wanting the evening to end. But finally, the music stopped and people started gathering their coats and heading home, and Garrett walked Felicity back to the doctor's house through streets lit by moonlight reflecting off snow. At the door they paused, neither quite ready to say goodnight. "Thank you for inviting me," Felicity said. "I haven't had that much fun in longer than I can remember." "We should do it again," Garrett said. "The dance is monthly, but there are other social events. Church socials, barn raisings, that sort of thing, if you'd like to attend them with me." "I'd like that very much." Felicity hesitated, then took a breath and asked the question that had been on her mind all evening. "Garrett, what is this? Between us, I mean. I know we barely know each other, but it feels like more than just new friends." Garrett was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know exactly what it is," he admitted. "But I know that I think about you all the time, that seeing you tonight made me happier than I've been in years, that the thought of you being courted by someone else makes my chest hurt." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers warm against her skin. "I know it's fast, maybe too fast, but I'd like to court you properly, Felicity, if you're willing." Felicity leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. "I'm willing," she whispered. "More than willing." Garrett smiled and leaned down, and for a moment Felicity thought he was going to kiss her, but instead he pressed his lips gently to her forehead, a gesture that was somehow more intimate than a kiss would have been. "Good night, Felicity. Sleep well." "Good night, Garrett." She floated up to her room in a daze of happiness and lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening. She was being courted by Garrett Zimmerman, the man who'd literally dug her out of a snowdrift and said he'd dig until spring if he had to. The man whose eyes made her think of storms and summer meadows all at once. The man who was quickly becoming the most important person in her world. The courtship that followed was like something out of a storybook. Garrett came to town at least twice a week, sometimes on business but increasingly just to see Felicity. They took walks together through the snowy streets, went to church socials, sat on the porch of the doctor's house talking for hours while Martha Harrison smiled knowingly from inside. On one memorable occasion, Garrett took her out to his ranch, showing her the land he loved with such obvious pride that Felicity fell a little more in love with him just watching him talk about it. The ranch was impressive. A well-maintained spread with good grazing land and a sturdy house that Garrett's father had built with his own hands. There were cattle everywhere, shaggy winter coats making them look bigger than they actually were, and horses in a corral near the barn. Tommy lived in a smaller cabin on the property, but Garrett's house was clearly the main residence, and Felicity could see herself living there, making it into a home. The thought should have scared her, how quickly she was imagining a future with this man, but instead it felt right. Natural. Like this was always where she'd been heading, and the blizzard had just been fate's dramatic way of bringing them together. Garrett introduced her to the workings of the ranch, showed her how to feed the horses, let her try her hand at milking the cow he kept for personal use. She was terrible at it, getting more milk on her dress than in the bucket, and they both ended up laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Those moments of shared laughter felt as precious as the serious conversations they had, the slow revelation of hopes and dreams and fears that came with really getting to know another person. "I want children someday," Garrett told her one evening as they sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. "At least 3 or 4 if I'm blessed. I want this ranch to stay in the family, to build something that lasts beyond my own lifetime." "I want children too," Felicity said softly. "I always thought I'd be a mother by now, but life had other plans. Taking care of my own mother took precedence over starting my own family." Garrett reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You'll be a wonderful mother," he said with certainty. "Patient and kind and brave. Our children will be lucky to have you, our children." The casual way he said it, like it was a given that they'd have children together, made Felicity's heart race. They'd been courting for 6 weeks, and already Garrett was talking about their future in concrete terms. It should have been too much too soon, but instead it felt exactly right. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year, winter reluctant to loosen its grip. But gradually, the snow began to melt, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green, and the days lengthened until there was enough light to work by well into the evening. Garrett was busy with calving season, spending long hours in the fields making sure the newborns survived, and Felicity saw him less often. But when they were together, the connection between them only seemed to deepen. On a warm evening in early April, Garrett asked Dr. Harrison for permission to speak with him privately. They retired to the doctor's study, and Garrett felt his heart hammering as he prepared to ask the question that would determine his future. "Sir, I'd like to ask for your permission to marry Felicity," he said formally, standing straight despite his nerves. "I know we haven't been courting long, but I love her. I want to spend my life with her, build a future together, raise children on my ranch. I can provide for her, give her a good home, and I swear I'll spend every day trying to make her happy." Dr. Harrison studied him for a long moment, his expression serious. Then he smiled. "I'm not her father, Garrett, so technically you don't need my permission. But since you're asking, you have my blessing gladly. Felicity is like a daughter to Martha and me, and I can't think of a man I'd rather see her marry." He stood and shook Garrett's hand firmly. "Treat her well, and you'll have a partner for life. Felicity's the kind of woman who loves deeply and loyally, and once you have her heart, you'll have all of her." "I intend to treat her like the treasure she is," Garrett said, relief flooding through him. "Thank you, sir, for everything, including taking her on as your assistant. If you hadn't, she might never have come to Fairplay. I think fate would have brought you two together one way or another," Dr. Harrison said with a knowing smile. "Some things are just meant to be." 2 days later, Garrett took Felicity on a picnic to a meadow high up on his ranch land, a spot he'd loved since childhood for its view of the surrounding mountains. The grass was just beginning to green up, and wildflowers were starting to bloom in patches of purple and yellow. They ate sandwiches and drank cool water from a stream, and talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that felt like coming home. When they finished eating, Garrett took Felicity's hand and pulled her to her feet. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his heart hammering. "Something important." Felicity's eyes widened and she squeezed his hand. "All right." Garrett took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee right there in the meadow, holding her hand and looking up at her beautiful face. "Felicity Wagner, I know we met under unusual circumstances, and I know we haven't been courting very long by traditional standards, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about this. I love you. I love your courage and your kindness and your laugh and the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. I love how you fit into this town and my life like you were always meant to be here. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, raise children with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Felicity's face, and she was nodding before he even finished speaking. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Garrett, of course I'll marry you. I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes. When I think about how close I came to dying in that blizzard, how easily we might have never met, it makes me dizzy. But we did meet, and I fell in love with you the moment you started digging through all that snow, determined to save my supplies because you knew people needed them. You're the best man I've ever known, and I can't wait to be your wife." Garrett stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her properly for the first time. It was everything a first kiss should be, sweet and passionate and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard and grinning like fools. "I don't have a ring yet," Garrett admitted. "I wanted to ask you first, make sure you'd say yes before I spent money on something you might not like." "I don't care about a ring," Felicity said, cupping his face in her hands. "I just care about you." But Garrett insisted on getting her a proper engagement ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that he bought from the only jeweler in Fairplay. When he slipped it onto her finger a few days later, Felicity cried again, overwhelmed by how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She'd come to Colorado expecting nothing more than a job and a fresh start. Instead, she'd found love, home, and a future that seemed impossibly bright. They were married on a sunny day in June, in the white steepled church in Fairplay with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Felicity wore a simple white dress that Martha Harrison had helped her sew, with wildflowers from the mountain meadow woven into her hair. Garrett wore his best suit, looking nervous and proud and so handsome that Felicity could barely breathe when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. Tommy stood up as Garrett's best man, and Sarah, who'd become a close friend to Felicity over the past months, served as her maid of honor. Dr. Harrison walked her down the aisle, since she had no father to do it, and when he placed her hand in Garrett's, he whispered, "Be happy, my dear. You deserve it." The ceremony was simple and beautiful, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with such tenderness that Felicity felt tears slip down her cheeks yet again. They were happy tears this time, pure joy at the life spreading out before them. The reception was held in the community hall, with food provided by seemingly every woman in town and music that lasted well into the night. Felicity danced with her new husband, with Tommy, with Dr. Harrison, with what felt like every man in Fairplay who wanted to congratulate the new bride. But her eyes always found their way back to Garrett, solid and steady and real, watching her with love written plainly on his face. As the evening wound down and the guests started to leave, Garrett leaned close to Felicity and whispered, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Zimmerman. Mrs. Zimmerman." Felicity loved the sound of it, loved everything it represented. More than ready. They rode out to the ranch together under a sky full of stars, and Garrett carried her over the threshold of the house that was now their home. He'd spent the past week getting it ready, cleaning every surface until it shone, filling vases with wildflowers, making sure everything was perfect for his bride. Felicity looked around with wonder, seeing all the small touches that showed how much thought he'd put into making her feel welcome and loved. Their wedding night was everything it should be, tender and passionate and occasionally awkward in the way of all first times, but perfect because they were together. Afterward, lying in Garrett's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Felicity felt a peace she'd never known before. This was where she belonged. This was home. The first year of their marriage was an adjustment, learning to share space and make decisions together, and navigate the inevitable disagreements that came with two strong-willed people building a life. But beneath it all was a foundation of love and respect that made even the difficult moments bearable. Garrett taught Felicity the intricacies of ranch work, and she surprised both of them by taking to it naturally, especially the work with the horses. Felicity continued to assist Dr. Harrison part-time, riding into town twice a week to help with patients, and Garrett never objected to her keeping her own work and interests. They talked about everything, sometimes late into the night, learning the landscape of each other's minds and hearts. Garrett told her about his childhood, about his parents and the dreams they'd had for this land. Felicity shared memories of her mother, the good times before the illness, and found that talking about it with Garrett made the grief easier to bear. They dreamed together about the future, about the children they'd have and the legacy they'd build. Their first winter as a married couple was hard, with storms that rivaled the one that had brought them together. But now Felicity faced them from the safety of a sturdy house with a husband who loved her, and they seemed less frightening somehow. On the coldest nights, they'd lie together by the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, and Garrett would tell stories or play his guitar while Felicity listened and felt grateful for every moment. In the spring of their second year, Felicity realized her monthly courses had stopped. She waited another month to be sure, then told Garrett the news one evening after supper. He was so happy he actually picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a boy, and Felicity laughed with him, feeling joy bubble up inside her like a spring. The pregnancy was relatively easy, though Felicity got sick in the mornings for the first few months and was constantly tired. Garrett fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting she rest and not work too hard, until Felicity had to remind him that women had been having babies while doing farm work since the beginning of time, and she wasn't made of glass. But his concern was sweet, and she loved him for it. Dr. Harrison examined her regularly, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy, and Martha threw Felicity a party where all the women in town brought gifts and advice, some of it useful and some of it absolutely terrifying. Sarah, who'd married Tommy the previous fall, confided that she thought she might be expecting too, and the two friends spent happy hours talking about raising their children together, cousins who'd grow up as close as siblings. Felicity's labor started on a cold December morning, right around the anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together. Garrett rode to town through light snow to fetch Dr. Harrison, and the older man arrived with his medical bag and a calm demeanor that helped settle everyone's nerves. Martha came too, to help with the practical matters, and between them they guided Felicity through the long, difficult process of bringing a new life into the world. Garrett stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when she squeezed hard enough to leave bruises. When she screamed, he looked like he wanted to take the pain for her, and when she cried, he wiped her tears and told her how strong she was, how proud he was of her, how much he loved her. Finally, after what felt like forever, a baby's cry filled the room and Dr. Harrison announced, "It's a boy, a healthy baby boy." Garrett looked at Felicity with wonder in his eyes as the doctor placed their son in her arms. He was tiny and red and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to anyone within a mile. Felicity counted his fingers and toes through her tears, marveling at the miracle of him, this person who was half her and half Garrett, a physical manifestation of their love. "What should we name him?" she asked, looking up at her husband. Garrett touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, his expression soft with awe. "What about Samuel, after my father?" "Samuel Zimmerman, Samuel," Felicity repeated, testing it out. "I like it. Samuel Garrett Zimmerman." "Perfect," Garrett said, and leaned down to kiss first his son's forehead, then his wife's lips. "You're perfect, both of you." Becoming parents changed them in ways both expected and surprising. The sleepless nights were hard, the constant demands of a newborn exhausting, but every smile, every milestone, every moment of watching their son grow made it worthwhile. Garrett was a natural father, patient and gentle and endlessly creative in finding ways to soothe a crying baby. Felicity marveled at seeing this strong, capable rancher reduced to silly faces and baby talk, doing whatever it took to make Samuel laugh. They settled into new rhythms, finding balance between ranch work, Felicity's continued medical assistance, and raising their son. Tommy and Sarah's daughter was born 4 months after Samuel, and true to their dreams, the cousins became playmates, growing up together on neighboring ranches. The extended family gathered often for meals and celebrations, and Garrett's small house rang with laughter and life in a way it never had before. 2 years later, Felicity gave birth to twin girls, Rose and Ruth, and Garrett joked that his household had suddenly become overwhelmingly female. The twins were identical, with their mother's auburn hair and their father's gray-green eyes, and they kept everyone on their toes with their energy and mischief. Samuel took his role as big brother seriously, already protective of his little sisters even though he was barely old enough for the responsibility. Dr. Harrison retired when Felicity's twins were 6 months old, and in a move that surprised no one, he asked Felicity to take over his practice. She was reluctant at first, worried about balancing a full medical practice with 3 small children, but Garrett encouraged her to do it, pointing out that she was the most qualified person in town and people needed her skills. Together they worked out a system where she'd see patients in town 3 days a week, with Garrett managing the children on those days, and she'd be available for emergencies the rest of the time. It was exhausting and challenging, and sometimes overwhelming, but Felicity loved it. She loved being a mother and a wife and a doctor, loved the full, rich life she'd built in this mountain town. Sometimes, usually late at night when she was particularly tired, she'd think back to that terrified woman stuck in a snowdrift, sure she was going to die alone. That woman had been so lost, so afraid, with no idea that her entire life was about to change for the better. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Felicity back to the meadow where he'd proposed. It was June again, wildflowers in full bloom, and they brought a picnic just like that first time. The children were with Tommy and Sarah for the afternoon, giving them rare time alone together. They ate and talked and eventually just lay in the grass side by side, holding hands and watching clouds drift across the brilliant blue sky. "Do you ever think about that day in the blizzard?" Garrett asked quietly. "About how easily it could have gone differently?" "All the time," Felicity admitted. "If you hadn't been in that cabin, if you hadn't seen my wagon, if you'd decided it wasn't worth the risk to come help a stranger in a storm. So many things had to go exactly right for me to survive, for us to meet. It feels like fate." "It was fate," Garrett said firmly. "It had to be. No other explanation makes sense." He turned to look at her, propping himself up on one elbow. "That day when I was digging through all that snow, I remember thinking that I'd dig forever if I had to, and I meant it. Even then, before I knew you, before I loved you, something in me recognized that you were important, that saving you mattered. Looking back now, I think some part of me was already falling in love with you, even in those first moments." Felicity's eyes filled with tears, the good kind, and she reached up to touch his face. "I fell in love with you then too, with your determination and your kindness and the way you just kept digging, no matter how impossible it seemed. You saved my life that day, Garrett. Not just from the cold, but from the loneliness and grief I'd been drowning in for so long. You gave me a reason to live fully again, to open my heart, to take risks. You gave me everything." Garrett kissed her, slow and deep and full of 5 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. When they finally pulled apart, he said, "You gave me everything too. A home full of love and laughter, children to carry on the family name, a partner who understands me and challenges me and makes every day better just by being in it. I'd dig through 1,000 blizzards for you, Felicity. I'd do anything, go anywhere, face any challenge as long as I get to do it with you by my side." "Well, fortunately, there are no blizzards today," Felicity said, laughing through her tears. "Just sunshine and wildflowers and the man I love more than anything in the world." They stayed in the meadow until the sun started to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Then they gathered their things and rode home together, to the house full of children and noise and life, to the future they were building together one day at a time. Over the years that followed, their family continued to grow. Felicity gave birth to 2 more children, another boy they named James and a girl they called Caroline, bringing their total to 5. The house had to be expanded twice to accommodate everyone, and the ranch grew too, as Garrett bought additional land and increased his cattle operation. Samuel grew into a serious, responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, already planning to take it over someday. The twins were wild and free, riding horses before they could barely walk, and the younger 2 were still finding their way, watched over by their parents and older siblings. Tommy and Sarah had 4 children of their own, and the 2 families were constantly in and out of each other's houses, the children playing together while the adults worked side by side. The Zimmerman Ranch became known throughout the region as one of the finest operations in Colorado, and Felicity's medical practice served the community with skill and compassion for decades. They faced challenges, of course. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle lost to disease or predators, accidents and illnesses that tested their strength. But they faced everything together, and their love never wavered. On their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren because Samuel had married and started a family of his own, Garrett stood and raised his glass in a toast. 25 years ago, I found my wife buried in a snowdrift, he said, and everyone laughed because they'd all heard the story 100 times. I dug for hours to get her out, and somewhere in all that digging, I fell in love. Best day's work I ever did. He looked at Felicity, his hair now gray at the temples but his eyes still that same striking storm cloud color. I told you that day I'd dig forever for you, and I meant it. I still mean it. Every day with you is a gift, Felicity. You're the love of my life, my partner, my best friend. Here's to 25 more years and whatever comes after that. To 25 more years, everyone echoed, and Felicity wiped away tears as she looked around at the family they'd built, the life they'd created together. Later, when the party had wound down and the house was quiet, Garrett and Felicity sat on their porch in the twilight, holding hands and listening to the evening sounds of the ranch. It was a moment of perfect peace, of contentment so deep it felt like it might overflow. "Thank you," Felicity said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what? For digging. For not giving up even when it seemed impossible. For loving me enough to build all of this." She gestured at the house, the barn, the land stretching out before them in the fading light. Garrett raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for being worth digging for saying yes when I asked you to build a life with me, for giving me everything I never knew I needed." He paused, then added with a smile in his voice, "and for not dying of cold while I was working." "That helped too." Felicity laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet evening, and Garrett laughed with her. And they sat there together as the stars came out one by one, two people who'd found each other in the middle of a blizzard and built something warm and lasting and real. Years later, when they were old and gray and their children had children of their own, Garrett and Felicity would sit in those same chairs and hold those same hands, still in love after a lifetime together. When people asked their secret, Garrett would always say the same thing, with that slight smile that had never quite left his face since the day he married her. "I'd dig forever for her," he'd say simply. "And she was worth every shovelful." And Felicity would squeeze his hand and add, "And he actually did it, which is how I knew he was the one." They grew old together on that mountain ranch, surrounded by love and family and the land they'd tended for so long. And when their time finally came, decades after that fateful blizzard, they went peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their love story would live on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward into the future. The Zimmerman ranch stayed in the family, passing from Samuel to his children and then to theirs, and every generation knew the story of how it all began. They knew about the blizzard, about the wagon buried in snowdrifts, about the cowboy who dug for hours and said he'd dig forever. They knew about the love that grew from that desperate moment, love that lasted a lifetime and beyond, love that became the foundation for everything that came after. And on cold winter nights, when the snow came down thick and the wind howled around the house, the current generation of Zimmermans would gather by the fire and tell the story again, keeping alive the memory of Garrett and Felicity, and the day fate brought them together in the most dramatic way possible. It was a story about courage and determination, about second chances and new beginnings, but most of all, it was a story about love, the kind of love that digs through impossible obstacles and never gives up, the kind of love that lasts forever. And somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, if you listen closely on a quiet day, you can almost hear the echo of that love, still strong after all these years, still bright and true and eternal. Because some loves are like that, forged in crisis and tempered by time, growing deeper and richer with every passing year until they become something transcendent, something that exists beyond the boundaries of individual lives. Garrett dug Felicity out of that snowdrift all those years ago, but the truth was, they saved each other. She saved him from loneliness and a half-lived life, from the prospect of growing old alone on a ranch with no one to share it with. He saved her from grief and purposelessness, from the darkness that had threatened to swallow her after her mother's death. Together, they built something beautiful and lasting, a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of kindness and courage and not giving up even when everything seems impossible. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the blizzard or the buried wagon or the dramatic rescue, though those made for a good story. What mattered was what came after, the quiet daily choice to love and honor and cherish each other through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow, through every moment of their long, full lives together. That was the real story, the one that mattered most. And it was a story that ended not with death, but with life, abundant and rich and still spreading outward like ripples on a pond, touching generation after generation who carried forward the legacy of two people who loved each other completely and built a family and a life that honored that love every single day. On the mantel in the main house of the Zimmerman ranch, there hung a photograph, old and faded with time. It showed a young couple on their wedding day, the man tall and serious with kind eyes, the woman smiling with joy and love written plainly on her face. And beneath it, engraved on a small brass plate, were the words that had become the family motto, the phrase that summed up everything they believed about love and commitment and never giving up. "I'd dig forever for you." And they did. Through everything life threw at them, through challenges and triumphs, through the ordinary moments that made up a life and the extraordinary ones that defined it, Garrett and Felicity dug forever for each other. They worked for their love, fought for it when necessary, nurtured it and tended it like a garden until it grew into something magnificent and strong and capable of weathering any storm. That was their legacy. That was what they passed down through the generations. Not land or money or possessions, though those were there too, but something far more valuable. They passed down the knowledge that true love exists, that it's worth fighting for, that the obstacles in your path are just opportunities to prove how much you're willing to sacrifice for the person who holds your heart. And every child born into the Zimmerman family grew up knowing that they came from love, real love, the kind that digs through blizzards and never stops digging, the kind that builds homes and families and futures, the kind that lasts forever. That knowledge shaped them, gave them a foundation of security and hope that carried them through their own lives and loves and challenges. The blizzard buried her wagon in snowdrifts. The cowboy dug for hours and said he'd dig forever for her. And from that moment of crisis and courage grew a love story that never ended, that continued on through the years and decades and generations, as eternal and enduring as the mountains themselves, as constant and unchanging as the stars above. And that, in the end, was exactly as it should be.